Thanks, Nick, for the kind introduction. I must really say I was very inspired yesterday by the event. I thought this was really exactly how this should be, where schools, employers actually collaborate in a very practical way. And you could see the students and employers talking in ways like you wish it would happen anywhere. I'm going to approach the topic of schools, skills, employers a bit from the other end. I'm looking at the skills that people actually have, and then look at the role that schools, employers play in creating this and how we can strengthen that role. First of all, the impact of those skills on people's life chances are now beyond any doubt. You can see that most clearly when you look at problem-solving skills in technology-rich environments. You could see actually they predict your employment. They predict a big chunk of your wages. Now you're 4.5 times as likely to be an above medium wage earner if you perform at what we call level 3 on our problem-solving skill test as opposed to level 1. And this is for the entire adult population. But it's not just about economics. You can see strong relationships with health, with your propensity to volunteer, with political efficacy, and even with trust. So I think that's something that we need to keep in mind, that there is an economic price, but also a very important social price. And at the very same time, and many have alluded to this, it's also clear that more education doesn't guarantee better skills, better jobs, better lives. Now, in Japan, one of the most successful school systems, you can see 80% of employers saying they can't find the people with the skills they need. Now, that this happens in India and Brazil, the next countries on the list, is easier to understand. But in the case of Japan, it tells you a story that we really need to look at carefully. The issue really is to do with how do we know what those skills are that drive economic and social outcomes. And once again, one thing that our data show very clearly, I'm going to highlight this with a few data points. The world economy no longer pays you for what you know. Google knows everything. No. It pays you for what you can do with what you know, and that difference is very, very significant. And then comes the question of this conference, really. How do we actually think about different forms of provision, different modes of provisions, different providers in providing the right mix of skills in effective ways? No. It's not the end of the story. Deploying the skills effectively, a very big challenge. If you don't get that right, developing talent is not of much use. And this is actually an area where I find the United Kingdom a very good example. Our data suggests that the United Kingdom is very good in extracting value from available talent. I think that's an important part. And then the ultimate question is who pays for what, when, and how. For school education, the answer is probably quite easy. When you look at universities, you have found an answer. Many other countries not yet. When you look at sort of apprenticeship, vocational education, it becomes actually very, very tricky. This whole issue of lifelong, life-wide learning, employer engagement actually is not easy to sort out. But I'm going to look with you through some answers that different countries have found. So at the end, it's all about three things. It's about developing the right skills. It's making sure that you activate them. That's more labor market policies. I'm going to not skip that for today's presentation. But I want to put a lot of emphasis also on the last part. How do we put skills to effective use? Because employer engagement is not just about the development of talent, but also to reduce the transaction cost between skills that are available and how they are being deployed. So let's look at a couple of data points and issues that we need to think about when developing talent, whether this is in school or among employers. First of all, understanding changing demand for skills is one of the toughest challenges that all school systems face. Now, the world changes very rapidly. The demand for skills changes very rapidly. And how do you actually develop the eyes and ears of curricula and school systems to see those changes? And that's where employers actually come in a big way. We talked a lot about apprenticeship, providing places, but actually engaging employers in curriculum design, in curriculum implementation. So those are very, very important parts as well. A couple of points. I mentioned the impact of problem-solving skills on people's life chances. This is actually the share of adults, 16 to 65-year-olds, with good to reasonable to good problem-solving skills in a kind of ICT environment. We talk about this flat world, digital society, knowledge economy, and so on. But you can actually see it's only about 1/3 of adults on average that have the skills to actually take advantage of this flat, digitized world. And if I would show you some of those tasks, actually, you would be surprised. Ask yourself, how could anyone possibly get those things wrong? But you go out on the street, and you can actually find a lot of people not well prepared for this. And obviously, those skills are not just developed at school. Actually, they couldn't possibly, because many of those people have been at school at a time when technology didn't exist, at least not in the form we know it today. So I guess you will all tell me, well, this is all a problem of older generations. You're not keeping up with technological changes. But you look at the young generation, and the picture looks better, but not that much. Actually, you're still talking only about half of young people having those kinds of skills that actually matter. And you look at the United States is a good example, but the UK also. The younger bar is not that much longer than the older bar. So there are a lot of people in a lot of places lacking those kinds of elementary foundational skills. Why is that important? And we touched on this in the panel. When you actually look at job growth, you can see for people with medium to high level problem solving skills in a digital environment, you can see really very good job growth between the late 90s and 2009. For people with very low levels of problem solving skills, you can see that those lines have been more or less flat because those jobs have been quite stable. And it's the people in the middle range that have seen the steepest decline. In the panel we discussed there were different competing economic theories, arguing for this polarization of labor markets. Actually, no, this is not theory. This is actual data. We can now measure those kind of things because we have actual test data about people. And you can actually project it against employment. And you can see this is a very real situation that the demand for skills is fundamentally changing. And you ask yourself to what extent schools and educational institutions have adapted to this. You can also look at this. Unfortunately, I don't have this data for England. I'm showing you data for the United States here. When you actually split things into different categories, skill categories, you can see manual skills on the decline. Now, that's no surprise, but sort of flattening out in a way because there are a lot of manual skills still left. Routine cognitive skills, actually the skill category with the steepest decline. Now, the kind of things that schools used to be best at. The kind of things that are easy to teach, the kind of things that are easy to test. Memorizing something, reproducing something, academic knowledge is actually what labor markets need less and less. The big increases happen on what we call non-routine analytic skills. That's your capacity to extrapolate from what you know. Use and apply your knowledge in a novel situation. And non-routine interpersonal skills, your capacity to collaborate, connect, compete with other people. And you can already see when you look at this diagram how much important the workplace becomes, because those are the kind of skills that you only learn or deploy in a real-world context. So again, you look at a historically relatively short period, and you can see that actually what is demanded in terms of skill utilization is actually changing quite rapidly. If you summarize this, there are sort of three categories of skills that always come out when you look at the demand. One is ways of thinking. It's about creativity, critical thinking, problem solving, decision-making, learning. It's about ways of working, communication, collaboration. And it's about tools for working. This is like technology, digital technology, but also literacy and numeracy, the kind of social cultural tool that allow us to access, manage, integrate, evaluate information. Those things are becoming sort of the currency of our economies now. So that's what we know about the demand, but monitoring it, tracking demand is very important, and that's actually where employers come so much into the equation. It's not easy though. Employers are very good in telling you what skills they need today. They're not as good in telling you what skills they need in the long run. That's where sort of policy really has an important part to do. How do schools actually add to the quality or develop quality in education and training? Well, our PISA study is one way to measure this, and the reason it is good at that is because it focuses exactly on non-routine analytic skills. PISA doesn't measure the reproduction of subject matter content, but you have to really creatively apply your knowledge. And you can see how large sort of countries, how widely countries vary, both in terms of performance, but also in the extent to which they provide children from all social backgrounds with learning outcomes. There's one interesting, the reason I'm showing you this is actually because I want to show you something slightly different. This is what happens in today's schools, 15-year-olds. And then we also tested young adults, 16 to 25-year-olds. And then we put both of it together. On the horizontal axis, the adults, the young adults. On the vertical axis, the PISA children. And of course, we made a time lag behind this, so this is approximately the same cohort. What do you see when you look at this chart? Pretty much countries lining up on a line. When you see this as a statistician, you think this is fantastic. You have different measurement tools. They give you the same answers for the same people, so there must be a lot of there must be very reliable tools, very different measurements. When you think about this as a policymaker, you get actually worried. What it actually tells you in most countries, there are very few exceptions to this. Norway here, a bit of Finland, Sweden. But in most countries, basically, you can more or less predict the skills that people have in the age group 16 to 24 if you know what they were able to do at the age of 15. We're not adding that much in terms of, or we're adding similarly. Where there are large disparities in the young population, we see them coming out later. And that is sort of one of the fundamental challenges, is sort of getting the workplace engaged in education is not just about schools, it's sort of continuing that learning track. And the results that you can see are just not very encouraging in that sense. It has to do with fostering lifelong skills-oriented learning instead of mapping, sort of summing up qualifications in front of people's life courses. And I want to show you why this is so important when you look again at skills level data. These are, Japan is a country where it's very highly skilled, we all know that. These are the skills of Japanese adults with different qualifications. And you can see on average, people with secondary degrees are doing better than those with below them, and then people with university degrees come out on top. But there's also a lot of overlap. The middle half of the population actually overlaps. There are a lot of people with school qualifications as highly skilled as some people with university qualifications, and so on. So this tells us again, the sources of skills are not just, this is not just about the quality of education institutions, but a lot about different forms of learning at the workplace, in life, and so on. And it becomes even more interesting when you do this across countries. When I put Italy into the picture, you can see actually the Japanese high school graduates are more highly skilled than the Italian university graduates. So the kind of formal qualifications that we usually use to sort of identify the skills people have are not very good predictors, neither within countries nor across countries in terms of the skills people have actually acquired. Again, these are about, and I'm going to come back to this when I talk about skill match at the end. It has to do with involving employers in designing curricula, delivering educational programs. And I want to just show you one data point on this that is also quite striking. When you look actually young people in education between the ages of 16 and 25, these are the skill levels across successive age cohorts, and you can actually see, if you are in education, you learn something. This line is going upwards in the right direction. But look what happens when you combine education and work. You start out lower, but this is a selection effect. In some countries, it's very strong. It's not the first choice of people, combining education and work. But you actually end up at the very same point. So skill acquisition, literacy and numeracy, the combination of education and work can actually be very effective in raising people's skills. Even when you see at people who only are in work, this is the orange line here, you can see that line is pretty steep. They never reach that point. Again, that's likely a selection effect. But the sort of curve is really quite good. The only line that goes south is the one who are not in education nor in work. That comes back, someone else mentioned that before, the importance of giving young people a chance. But I think this illustrates in powerful ways why it is so fruitful to actually integrate education and work. So how can we do that? Well, there are some lessons that we have drawn from our analysis in how you can do that well. Of course, the way in which this articulates itself in different countries varies, but it has to do with engaging employers, but also union and a fair number of other stakeholders to make sure that the programs and the labor market needs are well aligned. And there are very good examples for how this can be done. This is not about the provision that is simply to ensure that the ideas, curricula, programs have common threads. It has to do with finding out what employers think about content of curricula and qualifications in terms of meeting current labor market needs and having a good dialogue and discussion on that. Making sure that employers help to adapt those curricula to emerging requirements and also to develop qualifications and workplace training arrangements. So getting the views of employers on those kinds of things is critical. It has to do a little bit with the infrastructure for this. Today, the example of Switzerland was raised. It's actually a good example that actually has quite elaborate institutions that actually engage employers and unions at different levels of the system, or even at the level of the individual provider of services. So actually, this doesn't happen by itself. So saying employers should engage will not lead to something without having a really strong institutional framework to facilitate this dialogue. At least that's our experience when you look at the countries doing that well. It has to do with ensuring that institutions and mechanisms to engage employers represent the diverse perspectives and opinions that are actually within employer groups. You know, employers are not employers. They have actually quite different interests, capacities. And that size of employers is one big factor in this, but it's also the nature of work that drives that. And that is very, very important that diversity is actually well represented. What we actually find in most countries is that those systems are heavily biased towards a specific group of employers. We need to understand, not necessarily reconcile, but at least understand that different people have different incentives. If you speak with large employers, they tell you that they all need generic skills, transversable skills, the kind of things I mentioned at the beginning, problem solving, creativity, interpersonal skills, and so on. When you actually break that down, you talk to the people who actually hire, you get to much more narrow kind of skill profiles. Trade unions have every incentive to ensure that people have access to good training, and they do that, but they also have incentives to limit access to occupation. And it's really about understanding how those different incentive structures work on different people that helps us sort of devise effective policies. And if you get all of this right, you can actually think about what's the appropriate role of government to actually support the interests of students and then also to balance the interests of employers and unions. But thinking through the different interests and incentives of the different stakeholders is something that we find very, very important in finding an appropriate way to integrate education and work. I don't want to talk too much about sort of cross-border skill policies. They are of increasing importance, but that's sort of more of a different theme. I want to sort of pull this all a bit together on the development of skills side. What does it mean for education employers? What we do see is that many of the current educational programs are not meeting labor market needs. You can see that very nicely in employment figures. They do not adequately prepare young people for jobs, and they are often quite strongly separated from what our modern economies actually need. How can we do better? At least when we looked at systems that actually are very good at that, this comes again to engaging employers to providing the right mix of skills, finding a good balance between what students want to do and what employers can offer. The issue of curriculum development, instructional systems. Now, if you get talented employers with pedagogical talent in those schools, that can be sort of a very powerful way. And actually, I think the event yesterday in Basildon was a great example of how you can actually make that happen. It doesn't need to happen every day, but having sort of a few moments in a student's career is very important. I want to still stress that the crucial part of this is really early on in students' career, because it's not just about telling them what career options there are, but motivating, for example, before in the presentation, STEM education, interest in STEM. You know, if you want someone to actually study hard in mathematics, choose subjects that are difficult but very, very important, that needs to happen early on, because those trajectories are actually closing off very quickly. You know, at age 15, 16, If you're not good enough in mathematics to become an engineer, you're not going to learn those kinds of skills. So getting those kinds of targets into this, in the perspectives of young people, what I want to be, is really, I think, something that we find very important. Numeracy, literacy skills, they're actually always crucial, and that's harder, when you think sort of apprenticeship only focusing on occupational specific skills, that is far too narrow because those are key employability skills. Career guidance, many of you have mentioned that. That's also something that comes up all the time in our analysis, and it has sort of 3 dimensions. First of all, it's about providing good career guidance, and that simply needs to recognize that there is a lot more choice now than there was in the past. It's much harder to navigate a fast-changing and rapidly evolving system, and that makes career guidance ever more important and ever more difficult. It is to do with providing reliable and impartial sources, and that sounds trivial, but it's far from it. Often you have actually the interests of institutions, of education providers, and career guidance mixed, or you mix career guidance with psychological counseling, all those kinds of things, and that's actually, in our analysis, not helpful. Develop effective guidance services that can yield large returns by developing the career-related skills, self-awareness, self-esteem, helping young people to understand what they have a passion for, helping young people understand whether they can become really, really good at what they have a passion for. Those are things that actually career guidance can help with. Second dimension is making sure that there's a coherent, independent, and comprehensive guidance profession. Again, our analysis suggests that it's really about a separate profession of career advisors that you need, that those people have a very good knowledge of the labor market, and that they usually only get by having been in the labor market recently themselves, that they know something about careers and learning abilities, that they are very, very good at finding young people's interests, aptitudes, and objectives, so that they can help to make them relevant choices and manage their careers, and so on. And then again, I stress once more the independence of guidance professionals from the institutions which they serve. And the third aspect is really about support with resources, information, and also evaluation. Making sure that the key elements of guidance are proactively delivered to all students. That's not a matter of just helping those who are struggling, but helping every student really find their field. It's keeping those things up to date in a fast-changing world, very, very difficult, and then properly evaluate career guidance. That's also something that our analysis suggests is important. So career guidance, really a very important element in this, but it doesn't end there. It's also ensuring that teachers are well prepared with industry experience. And many countries do that way when it comes to vocational educational programs or institutions. But that's only half the story. This is really something that you would wish in almost any institution to happen. This has to do with encouraging trainers to spend some time of their life in industry. It has to do with pathways of recruitment and making it easier for those with industry skills to become part of the workforce of educational institutions. And that's actually, England is quite good at that. It's quite possible for you to move from a different profession into schooling. Now, it's very difficult to do that in many other European countries, but very, very important. Provide good pedagogical and other preparation for trainers in the companies. Now, in a way, you need the talent of schooling, good pedagogical experience, good guidance in the companies, and you need the workplace experience in the schools. That's sort of the magic trick, really. It's about maximizing the use of workplace training. We have really found that that is the key to effective kind of learning, that you maximize the element that is spent at the workplace, to ensure that the framework for workplace training really encourages students and also employers to make full use out of it, and of course that it's of high quality. Using effective tools. There are actually our research has shown that there are quite sort of concrete tools that can help engaging employers and unions and policy provision. It's about qualification frameworks, quality assurance, standardized national assessments. Those tools actually have proved to be quite effective in that. And all of that should give you high quality learning for all. So actually you can sequence the kind of steps quite well when you look at education systems that have done that well, the integration of education and work. So what it's all about is really about finding out what students want to study, finding out what employers need, and then making sure that that is provided at the best possible place. Now, linking programs and places to employers' willingness to provide learning. No? We have actually quite skeptical of using sort of financial incentives or tax incentives for employers. If you pay someone to provide an apprenticeship place, that's not going to result in the best possible quality. No? It doesn't result in the kind of prestige that you want to associate with this. No? If you are a student and well, I'm only here because someone from the government pays my employer to do this place. It's really about finding out, what is in the interest of employers and combining this. It's about assessing future skill needs through consultations with employers and instruments like this. But it's actually not rocket science. There are education systems doing that quite well, and there are some that have actually seen remarkable improvements in this. Some, you take in a system like in Singapore that had absolutely no tradition. Academic education was the sole revered route to success in that country. Today, you have actually very prestigious vocational routes, very strong employer engagement in academic institutions. So a lot of things can actually change in those kind of things. The middle part, I don't want to touch on too much. It's about how we activate the skilled supply. It is a very important part of the equation, but not so closely related to our theme. But I want to touch a bit on the last part. How do we put skills to effective use? One of the things that we see is actually skill match makes a huge difference for people. If you are in a situation that you have great skills and a very demanding job, you earn a lot when you're young and you keep growing in your earnings. No? If you have a skill deficit, you have a very demanding job, but you're not that skilled, you actually keep growing as well in your salaries, probably because you continue learning. Now, you don't start as high because your employer is not going to pay you for things that you don't know, but you keep sort of growing. But if you have a skill surplus or a low match situation, this goes the other way around. So it's very important to keep in mind that skill match actually does have real consequences for work situations. When you look at the actual numbers behind that, what do we know about skill match? When we look at qualification mismatch, the numbers are very large. No? You can see for the UK, for example, you talk about 20% of the working age population that say they have better qualifications that someone else needs when they enter their job. So the problem looks quite big. No? When you look at actual skill mismatch, the numbers actually get a lot smaller. No? For the UK, you can confidently say that it's well below 10% of people who are actually overskilled for the kind of work they do, no? Or underskilled. So labor markets seem to be quite good, particularly in countries like the UK, in absorbing talent and putting it to most effective use. So there is actually not a big kind of skill mismatch picture, not as much as it is portrayed sometimes in the media and elsewhere. And that's very important to keep that in mind, because one way to interpret this is actually the labor market adapts to the talent that is available. No? You produce better talent, you raise productivity. You're doing it not, then the workplaces adjust to this. There's one hypothesis at least. Helping young people gain a foothold in the labor market, that was already mentioned by many speakers today. Very, very important. We can see sort of the scarring effects of not doing that for many years to come. Making skills more transparent, very, very important. If some speakers spoke about, attaching value to workplace experience. Well, yeah, that value is only going to be there when you actually make it visible in some ways. No? Helping employers to make better use of their employees' skills. I show you an interesting contrast here. If you had looked carefully at the data on our adult skills survey, you would see that Japan was the top performer in terms of available skills, and the United States was pretty much at the bottom. If you look at actually how well skills are being used at work, you can see the United States outperforming Japan in every category, whether it's reading, writing, numeracy, ICT, problem solving at work, and particularly problem solving, used very little in Japan, even though the people are quite good at that, and a lot in the United States. That is a very important part of the equation as well. And you can see this in other skill domains. You can look at, task discretion, sort of learning abilities, influencing others, cooperating, self-organizing, same picture. And the United Kingdom is not quite as good as the United States, but similarly good in extracting value from the talent, whereas the Japanese have a lot of work to do on that part of the equation. And again, the workplace is a very important part to shape skills. Do these things actually matter? Gender difference are a very interesting way to look at this. On the vertical axis, I show you the wage gap between men and women. You can see basically Estonia, Japan, Korea is huge. On the horizontal axis, I show you the percentage difference in the use of problem-solving skills. This is not problem-solving skills themselves, because men and women have similar problem-solving skills. There is no gender gap. But the way those skills are being deployed explains 49%, almost half of the wage gap. And when you account for basically occupations, industry, and proficiency, you can actually see that this line becomes flat. So those are the drivers of the wage gap between men and women. You can again see sort of how we use skills at the workplace has a huge impact on outcomes and gender equality. It's about creating more value-added jobs. It's about helping local economies to move up the value chain. And again, that has to do both with the supply and the demand side. As actually, if there is no talent around, employers focus on cheap labor. You can shape this both on the demand and supply side. And there are some very, very good examples, including in the UK. I've mentioned a few here, where this has been done very well. And last but not least, it's all about entrepreneurship. And again, this is an example where employer engagement is absolutely key. In conclusion, those are the three levers we have been looked at. The challenge really is prioritizing investments, who should pay for what, when and how, what is the role of workplace learning. How do you reconcile short-term and long-term considerations and interests? And this is clearly where employers are on one side of the equation, but you need to add others. It's about a truly life cycle perspective, starting very, very early on. I think, if you want to get young people engaged in STEM, probably primary education is your best bet to achieve this and then to stay in this. But, of course, you want to keep people growing over the life cycle. And it's also, last but not least, it's really an issue of a whole of government approach. You really need very effective collaboration among many players in policy and practice and at the workplaces. And then obviously the issue of stakeholder interests, including employers, comes in. I want to stop here so that we have enough time for questions. Thank you very much.